My name is Graham Kerridge, and I'm a member of the State Council of AIIA. May I welcome you here tonight for what I'm sure will be a very interesting presentation and discussion, where we will be gaining an insight to the country, the people, and the current strategic considerations of Mongolia. I firstly wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're gathered for the event, the Turrbal and Jagera people, and pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Secondly, I wish to thank and express appreciation to Holden Redlich for making available this meeting space for events of the Institute. We're immensely grateful for their support. Mongolia, a country of approximately 3.5 million, is not just the largest landlocked country in the world, but is uniquely encircled by two superpowers, China and Russia. Over much of the last century, it was a vassal state of the Soviet Union, but since the early 1990s, it has trod an independent path while being economically linked with Russia for energy supplies and China for trade. While Australians in general may have little knowledge of modern Mongolia, many are becoming aware of it through the considerable number of students from Mongolia who are choosing to study here in Australia, in particular in Brisbane, and through the development of the mining sector, where many Australians have been involved. Tonight we have two speakers talking about Mongolia. Firstly, Nick Millward, who served in the US Marines in many locations, including the Indo-Pacific, and became familiar with Mongolia and Central Asia. He's currently undertaking a Master's in Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Queensland as a Rotary Peace Fellow. He's also an AIIA Next Gen leader. Secondly, we have Usukhbold, or Usko, maybe simpler, Chimedregzen, who is a PhD candidate in education policy at QUT, having earlier gained a Master's in Education Studies at the University of Queensland. Usko has worked extensively in education projects and management in Mongolia. Our speakers will speak for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then my colleague David Costello will moderate a question and answer session prior to our event finishing at about 7 p.m. Over to you, Nick, to start the session off.
Thank you so much, and I also want to express all my gratitude for everyone showing up here tonight, and for those that are online joining us, especially from Canberra. I know I didn't pronounce that correctly, but forgive me, I'm from America. So a little bit for how we expect tonight to go. I want to talk a little bit about big, broad brushstrokes of what's happening in Mongolia, giving you a little bit of the context specifically from the Mongolian People's Republic until now. Not looking to delve too much into ancient history about Genghis Khan or Kublai Khan, but there are some issues that actually do come up regarding Southern Mongolia or Inner Mongolia in the context of Kublai Khan and Genghis Khan. But I'll talk big picture, and then I will just warm you guys up for Usko, who's really the main speaker for tonight. And I'll keep it fairly brief because I don't want you guys to be listening to me too much, and we can delve into the question and answer session when you guys feel comfortable. So Mongolia is commonly referred to as being stuck between the hammer and the anvil, right? The second largest landlocked country, democratic country, stuck between Russia and China. A very, very terrible position to be stuck in, as you can imagine. And we want to share a little bit about the inside of Mongolia, and not just the rehearsed narrative of Mongolia as being land of Genghis Khan, the land of nomads, right? Or that Genghis Khan killed 40 million people and nomads are barbaric. There's a lot more to this country. And I think Australians, especially in this room, understand a little bit about Mongolia, specifically regarding the mining sector and Rio Tinto. There's a bit of a relationship there between most Australians and Mongolians there. But there's more to that, and there's more to Mongolia's development. So because there's too much history to cover, like I said, I want to focus on the Mongolian People's Republic in modern times. Mongolian People's Republic was considered the second communist country outside of the Soviet Union, and while it requested membership to the Soviet Union, Moscow deemed it as more beneficial to keep it as the second communist country because they could get additional votes and they could also keep a buffer state between, obviously, Russia and China, and that was in the best interest. After World War II, Moscow and Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong basically got together and said, we need to split up Mongolia for the sake of Russia and China. And we can go more into that in the Q&A, but I'll keep that brief. So while it requested membership, it was denied multiple times. And then communism actually had a fairly positive impact on a lot of the nomadic population of Mongolia. However, they did have a terrible experience with it in the early 1920s called the left deviation. And if you are interested in learning about their failed attempt at collectivizing and sedentarizing nomads, you can read a book called The Green-Eyed Lama. Quite famous book. It came out a few years ago, and it tells the story of how the Mongolian People's Republic basically massacred almost all of the Mongolian Buddhist lamas and a significant population of nomadic pastoralists as well. But 1920s, they recognized that they made a mistake. And then later on, they attempted to fix this and rectify this in the 1950s and 1960s by imposing basically a voluntary form of collectivization where they would tax heavily pastoral nomads. And pastoral nomads recognize that if they want to survive, they have to join the collective rather than being taxed heavily and making up for everyone else who left. So we saw a massive extermination, like I said, of the Buddhist monks. We saw in World War II, Mongolia actually contributed to World War II and the Soviet Union and prevented Japan from pushing further west into Eurasia. And what this actually ended up doing was that it's inextricably tied to the Soviet non-aggression pact with Japan. So Mongolia and the Soviet Union fended off in 1939 Japanese incursions in Manchuria. The Japanese and the Soviet Union basically said, yep, we're done, no one's going to win here. And so it allowed the Soviet Union to move most of their combat power towards the west. And so Mongolia played a pivotal role in that, and they continued to play a pivotal role throughout all of World War II by contributing lots of meat, as you can imagine, and lots of uniforms and warmer clothes to the forces on the Western Front. However, education, literacy improved dramatically as well. Ulaanbaatar, the capital city, really took form throughout the communist period. And like I said, Mongolia was able to fend off the Japanese incursions. So a lot of the older generation still views with nostalgia, they view the communist period. Obviously, that's challenged by the younger generation coming up now. And they see that there was a lot of negative impacts from the communist period, especially nepotism, which now takes form in form of corruption. But there were a lot of mixed feelings about the effectiveness of communism. If you look at some of the education policies, which Usko might talk about, what we see is that the communist attempts at educating the population is a lot of the women ended up leaving the countryside and going to the villages to raise their children, right? Because they had to go to school and there were no schools out in the countryside. So they go to the villages and a lot of the women would go as well. And so while that happened, women received a higher education. And if you look at that today, there's actually a majority of the college graduates in Mongolia that are females. Now, we don't see that translate directly into positions of power within the government, but you do see that in civil society organizations. A lot of civil society organizations in Mongolia are run by women, highly educated women who have come to Australia, right, on the Australia Award Scholarship, or gone to the United States, or to Japan, or to other Western countries especially, and have come back and have taken positions of power within civil society. But like I said, that still doesn't translate into government, which there's a lot of tension within that. So back to Mongolia's collapse, or Mongolian People's Republic collapse. After the Soviet Union collapsed, the MPR transitioned into a democracy as well. And it should be known that it was done peacefully. However, it suffered immensely for years under shock therapy recommendations from the West, right? It's commonly referred to as receiving a lot of shock, not enough therapy. And that's very common amongst Central Asian nations, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan as well. And so for years, a lot of poverty, a terrible job market for Mongolians, and people became really desperate. And so while it was great in a sense that it transitioned. It did not receive enough support from the outside. I've read a couple of reports that a lot of Westerners would come and they'd spend a week in the capital in UB and make recommendations about the Washington Consensus. And you can't know Mongolia, you can't know Mongolians by staying for a week in the capital city. You can see a lot, but it's not nearly enough to understand their market, right? And it was a pastoral nomadic commodities market at the time. And if you can't wrap your head around that, a lot of people are going to suffer by your recommendations. So a quick note about Mongolia's transition though. While it was peaceful, the golden magpie of democracy, Zorig, who was, if not the main activist, was one of the main activists, was murdered in his home. And it took all the way until 2016 for 3 individuals to be blamed for that. There's a lot of speculation about whether or not they were the ones who committed the crime, or they're just the scapegoats. But in general, Mongolia's democratic transition was fairly peaceful for most Mongolians. So, but I'll leave most of Mongolia's domestic politics over to Usko, who will do a much better job than myself. But I want to turn to Mongolia's foreign policy. And while I will not say that I'm an expert, I think we're always constantly learning. We should always be constantly learning. This is something that I've been focused on for the past 3 or 4 years. And it's fascinating. How can a landlocked democratic country get stuck and survive and at times thrive between Russia and China? And so their foreign policy is really, really interesting. We often tend to focus on the United States, on China and Russia, but how can you have these small powers? Look at Nepal stuck between India and China. Look at Mongolia stuck between Russia and China. How do these countries survive and at times thrive, like I said? So Mongolia's foreign policy is really summed up by the Mongolian proverb, a duck is calm when the lake is calm, right? And so their goal is to keep the lake as calm as possible. And so that's really tough when a landlocked country relies on China and Russia for 100% of their imports, exports, whether that means it's through permissions for flights or whether that actually means infrastructure. It's really hard when you're stuck between these 2 nations. And that's why Mongolia's first 2 pillars of their 3 pillars for foreign policy are relationship with Russia and relationship with China. And then the third one we'll get to later, but that's the third neighbor policy. So the first pillar, Russia, you could use it interchangeably, whether it's Russia or China. They're equally important in Mongolia's foreign policy. Mongolia imports approximately 28% of the goods from Russia and almost entirely all of their petrol from Russia. And about the western third of Mongolia relies on the Russian energy grid. And so we'll get more into it. And I know we have some experts that know about Mongolia's responses to Ukraine. But just keep that in mind when Mongolia does not vote in favor or against what Russia is doing in Ukraine. So the economic, geographical, and historical ties between Mongolia and Russia have made it difficult for Mongolia to basically separate itself from Moscow. And I believe also 2 recent former presidents of Mongolia were actually married to Russian women. You don't really see that with Mongolian presidents being married to Chinese. And so there is a little bit more of an affinity from the older generation, the older Mongolian generation for Russia, like I said, as they had a strong connection during the Soviet Union. Mongolian political leaders and diplomats still tend to rely quite heavily on Russia in maintaining their relationships. But it's chosen to remain politically neutral, like I said, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine for obvious reasons. And while many of us from the West especially have expressed our dismay and frustration with Mongolia's neutral positioning, or at least its lack of vocal condemnation, aside from Mongolia's former president Elbek Dorch, who has run around quite a bit extensively and petitioned for support for Ukraine. It's really hard. And President Zelensky actually spent a lot of his childhood in Erdenet, the second largest capital, the second largest city in Mongolia. So there are personal connections there as well. And so I'm sure it is not an easy approach for the Mongolian government to push, because a brash decision is going to end up with lives, right? In Mongolia, where the winter gets down to -45, -50, if you don't have heat in the West, if you don't have petrol in the West, that will translate to people dying, right? And Mongolia's winter is their natural disaster. And so if they can't take care of their animals, they can't take care of their people. What is the government doing? That kind of thing. So, but a really interesting part and component of this is the ethnic group, the Buryat Mongols. The Buryat Mongols basically got caught in Russia at the end of World War II when they split up Mongolia, and Russia took a significant portion of Mongolia. A lot of the ethnic Mongolians, the Buryats, were stuck, and there have actually been a lot of reports, at least in Mongolia and in Buryat Mongolia of Russia, that basically the Kalmyks and the Buryats are often used by the Russians in their fight in Ukraine, specifically as tank crews. So Buryats and Kalmyks are known for their discipline and known for cohesion. And so they're often put into tank crews and sent to the front. This has caused a lot of ethnic tension on the Mongolian side and back in Russia as well, because the Russian propaganda machine is basically saying a lot of these atrocities are being committed by other ethnic minorities within Russia, not necessarily ethnic Russians. And so this has created a lot of tension between the Buryat Mongols, the Kalmyks, and ethnic Russians as well. So, but enough about that. If you guys want to ask questions, we can get into that later. The second pillar is China, right? If it doesn't go through Russia, it goes through China. So you're talking anywhere 80 to 90% of most of their stuff, imports and exports, are going to go through China. Very uncomfortable position for any nation to be in. And Mongolia is finally beginning to see economic growth again because China has opened up their border, right? I've had a lot of friends that were living in Japan that were trying to send stuff back to Mongolia during COVID. And the Chinese government basically shut down the border and started charging anyone who's trying to ship something outside, right, or transitioning from China to another country. They started charging the individuals that were trying to ship stuff. So it was very, very tough for a lot of Mongolians to send stuff back home. And, you know, a lot of folks were saying that during COVID, that 1 kilogram of cucumbers cost the equivalent in Australia of about $20. And so with about 1/3 of the country living in poverty, this was really, really tough. COVID was really hard for Mongolia. Mongolia did well for the first 11 months, didn't have a single COVID case. Eventually they cracked in November, but they did a fairly decent job of controlling it and dealing with it. But a lot of the economic fallout from China closing their borders really, really impacted the poverty level in China. The poverty level in Mongolia, of course. But they have to craft their messages really carefully regards to China. For example, back in 2015, 2016, the Dalai Lama came to visit Mongolia, and he stayed for 4 days. And it was not a political, there were no political meetings on the agenda whatsoever, but Mongolian Buddhism actually stemmed from Tibetan Buddhism. So it's called the Yellow Hats. And they, you know, listen to the Dalai Lama, you know, they abide by a lot of his teachings. And so he was requested to come to Mongolia by the Buddhist sect. And China made it known ahead of time that they were uncomfortable with this, that they were unhappy with this. Mongolia still went through with it, and they allowed the Dalai Lama to visit, and China backlashed, right? And significant. They charged insane amounts for different commodities. They closed the borders at times. They just said, "Oh yeah, we're having issues. We can't open the borders right now." And it again had very negative impacts on Mongolia. And so Mongolia is very much so a victim of China's coercion, China's manipulating narrative as well. Back to ancient history, Kublai Khan, so Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan was actually the one who conquered China, and then he moved his capital down towards Beijing. And when he did that, the Chinese now are saying that, you know, Kublai Khan was actually Chinese. And so there's a huge manipulation of the narrative that we see, you know, obviously with Taiwan and Tibet and the Uyghurs in East Turkestan as well. We see a lot of that in response to Mongolia too. Okay, so they have to craft, like I said, China very carefully. So the third one, which I get really excited about, is called the third neighbor policy. That's the third pillar. Third neighbor policy is basically any country other than Russia or China. And a lot of times that's going to be framed in the concept of democratization, neoliberalism, right, and diversification of their economy. That is their main contextual and pragmatic approach, right, is to say, yes, we want to diversify our economy. And so you could look at that with Japan, with both Koreas, right, with the United States, with Australia. And they're also in the last 2 or 3 years starting to swing towards Central Asia, looking at Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan especially, to try and diversify their economy and try and keep their relations with all countries neutral. Most of the time, Mongolia's pursuit is a very neutral and impartial pursuit. They don't even belong to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is quite shocking. They also don't belong to the Eurasian Economic Union, who's shared and run by Russia. And so they pursue a strategy of impartiality and neutrality, right? Because they don't want to upset the lake, right? So third neighbor policy, this became really popular, even though it had been mentioned decades ago. Actually, back in the 1920s, they had talked about establishing relations with France, the UK, United States. It became really popular underneath President Elbig Dorch, who ran around basically all over trying to foster relations. And we can see this in the forms, like I said, of the economy, but we can also see this in the fact that Poland just reopened their embassy in Mongolia this week. They have to manage this very carefully, because if they align too much with democracies, they focus too much on democratic language or the strengthening of civil society organizations, this has serious implications for upsetting China and Russia and the status quo and disturbing the lake. But getting back to where can Australia fit into that as the third neighbor policy, obviously as a democratic country as well. Mongolia opened their embassy in Canberra in 2008, whereas Australia opened theirs in 2015 in Mongolia. There's a lot of potential for further strengthening of relations between Australia and Mongolia. They celebrated their 50 years of diplomatic relations just this past year. And other than the mining sector, other than the education sector, where we already see a lot of collaboration, there's a lot more that could be done at the community level. And I know we have some Rotarians in the room tonight. Rotarians are the perfect example of how we can look at establishing community relations between Mongolians and Americans. We have Mongolian students, we have Mongolians here tonight in Brisbane, right, that we could be looking to integrate with a lot of our community service and a lot of our community civil society organizations and fostering those relations at this level. So in years from now, as we progress forward, we can do it equally, right, and we can contribute equally to each other. And for example, there's an Australian club, Australian Rotary Club in Perth, that designs wheelchairs, versatile and adjustable wheelchairs for kids with cerebral palsy. And the Rotary clubs here in Australia are shipping, 164 of these to Mongolia to be dispersed out to the countryside. There's a lot of awesome potential that we in the room can focus on, while those that are in Canberra can focus on the higher level stuff. Yeah, I think that's enough for me for now, but I'll turn it over to Usko, who's the main speaker. So I look forward to your questions during the Q&A though. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you for getting here, and thank you for your interest in Mongolia. Nick actually gave the main lecture, so I have to improvise from mine to make it a puzzle. Yeah, and a couple of small bullet points facts. Mongolia is actually the least densely populated country in Mongolia, in the world. And during the COVID, the social distancing would be really easy because we have 2 people per 1 square kilometer. Yeah, and then World Bank categorized Mongolia as a lower middle income country with the GDP of $4,500. And most of the people speak half dialect of Mongolian language, and it's actually official language Mongolian. And we have only one ethnic minority, which is the Kazakh people, who lives in the Western Mongolian highlands. But we don't have any clash or any conflict with them. And a little bit of historical facts is during its peak, Mongolian Empire actually covered 23 million square kilometers from Pacific Ocean in the east and Persian Gulf in the west. So that gives the vast land of Mongol Empire. And lots of people interested in how great Mongol Empire dissolved. And the major reason is the four sons of Chinggis Khan actually got the 1/4 of Mongolia and got their own kingdoms. And Golden Horde is now what's Russia. And Yuan dynasty is what's Mongolia in China. And Chagatai Khanate is Central Asia. And Ilkhanate is Persia or Iran. So little known fact is that after the fierce invasion, there was actually a time called the Pax Mongolica, where other countries actually accepted the general overall rule of Mongolia, Mongol Empire, and that's protection of the empire is kind of promoted during that time for the other countries. And during this time, economic, cultural, and political innovations and ideas were widely exchanged between the East and West through the Silk Road. And some writers actually suggest that modern concepts like free trade or religious freedom or accessible and easy communication system were fostered during the Mongol Empire. And there's a really interesting book by an American, Jack Weatherford's book. Yeah. And but unfortunately, like after approximately 200 years after the establishment, Chinggis Khan's descendants were defeated by the Manchu people and other nomadic people in East Asia. But there is a that misconception that China was under the Mongolia was under the China during that time. But in fact, during that time, Mongolia and China was both under the Manchu Empire. And Mongolia got independent in 1911, to be exact, 29th of December 1911, which is 2 days before China got independent from Manchu. So technically, Mongolia was never under Chinese direct rule. Since then, since the independence, Mongolia got adopted its first constitution in 1924 and followed the socialist path. And during that time, Mongolia, 1/3 of Mongolia's GDP was provided by Russia and Council for Mutual Economic System, like COMCON. And for education, Mongolia followed and borrowed a Russian system. And as such, during the socialist time and even now, Mongolian education system is pretty similar to Russian system, which is teacher-centered and a little bit strict and that kind of thing. Yeah. Politically, Mongolia transformed its major social structure and social services into a neoliberal market-based models with the advice of International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and Asian Development Bank. And from those organizations, the string attached was to change it to the neoliberal system. Interesting fact is after the democratic revolution in 1992, the former Communist Party haven't disbanded. In fact, in first democratic election, the former Communist Party won the election. And from 1992 to 1996, which was the main period of transition, the former Communist Party ruled Mongolia. And since then, there were 8 elections, which only 2 elections the Democratic Party won. But effectively, the Mongolia is a post-socialist country with the post-communist party ruling it. And Mongolia has a hybrid parliamentary presidential system where the prime minister is nominated by the ruling party with the president's agreement, and president has almost full power over the judiciary system, holds power to appoint the chief judge of the Supreme Court and prosecutor general, chairs the National Security Council, and acts as a commander-in-chief of Mongolian armed force. And Mongolian economy relies heavily on the market prices of minerals, which is probably a similar thing to Australia. And mining sector generates 88% of exports and 22% of Mongolian GDP. So the Mongolian economy has gone through several boom and bust cycles. For example, like economic growth reached an exceptional 17.3% in 2011, but experienced just a 1% growth in 2016. So that's another interesting thing. Geopolitically, Mongolia is located, as Nick extensively explained, sandwiched between Russia and China. Ironically, during the 13th century, Mongols united and strengthened what's now Russia and China. But we jokingly say that about the sandwich metaphor, the best part of the sandwich is in the middle. So because of that dependence, as the third pillar, Mongolia really want to have this third neighbor policy strong. I think the main reason of that third neighbor policy is that Mongolia think that if there are different interests in Mongolia outside of Russia and China, then the West or that different interests will protect in times of if Russia and China decided to just take the Mongolia. So that's the main reason of the third neighbor policy. And in 2007, Mongolia designated Australia as their third neighbor. The Australian embassy opened in 2015 in Ulaanbaatar, but the Mongolian embassy has opened in Canberra in 2017. And what's another puzzle? There are actually 50 and more companies actively operating in Mongolia, such as Rio Tinto or Tees, lots of mining companies, and I have met lots of mining professionals in the streets of Brisbane who work there for Rio Tinto and holding the Rio Tinto and Mongolian notebook, and I just recognize them by the notebook. Yes. Another exchange of Mongolia and Australia is the educational exchange. Currently, there are 6,000 Mongolian students studying at the Australian higher education institutions, but 6,000 sounds less compared to China or India, but compared to just 3 million population, 6,000 is lots of number. And another interesting fact is that Mongolia can play a bridge between Western societies and in North Asian relationships. For example, I want to mention the North Korea. Mongolia actually has this promoted the positive relationship with North Korea and try to play a role in Korean Peninsula and its peace. So while promoting the peace building throughout the North Asia, and actually Mongolia offered to hold the Trump and Kim's meeting in 2019 in Mongolia, because Mongolia can be considered a friendly country for the North Koreans. Another interesting thing is religious identities and allegiances in Central Asia and Northeast Asia. Tibetan Buddhism is Buddhism and issues regarding the succession and reincarnation of the 15th Dalai Lama is another interesting topic for the Mongolia. Traditionally, there are 3 high-ranking Buddhist monks, and one of them is Dalai Lama, and one of them is Bhogat Lama in Mongolia, and one of them is Panchen Lama in China, in South Mongolia. But in 1995, Dalai Lama approved the succession of the Panchen Lama, the second highest ranking monk of the Tibetan Buddhism. But China kidnapped the 6-year-old kid and hid him for a couple of months. And after a couple of months, introduced another boy. This is the second highest ranking Lama that approved by Chinese government. And now he's effectively hold the power of the second highest ranking Lama and lives in China. But there was an interesting development for last month, actually, that the third highest ranking Lama was actually approved by the Dalai Lama in Mongolia. And he was a 10-year-old boy who was born in US but a Mongolian citizen. And that shows like how Mongolia tries to balance the things, Mongolian kid, but born in USA, hoping for the little bit of support from the Western side. And then another interesting thing is what's going to happen for the 14th Dalai Lama and the next 15th Dalai Lama. Traditionally, these the 3 highest ranking lamas will approve each other's next succession. So the Dalai Lama can approve the Panchen Lama. In the case of Dalai Lama's death, the other 2 lamas will approve the Dalai Lama's succession. So that plays lots of geopolitical importance in North Asia. Mongolia is trying to be a central of the Tibetan Buddhist, and with that, Mongolia wants to hold at least a little bit of a soft power in Central Asia. And in 2020, Dalai Lama said that his future will be decided by the Himalayan Buddhists of Tibetans and Mongolians. And then another puzzle that I note is that there is 2 political parties, the former Communist Party and the Democratic Party. Democratic Party is actually a union of 4 movements of democratic revolution. And as I mentioned before, that Democratic Party only won 2 election cycles during the last 30 years. And effectively, that Democratic Party has the support of United States and Western countries, but the Mongolian People's Party, which is the former Communist Party, has the support of Russia and China. And as soon as the People's Party won the election, they went to China or Russia to solidify their support.
Is People's Party running now? Is People's Party running now?
We might wait until
Oh, sorry.
the question Q&A.
Yeah, and then there's a rumor going on that Russia actually supported the MPP for their election, and Russia and China wants to hold the power in the Communist Party's hand. Yeah, and then my background is political science and education policy, so I'm a little bit far from the international relations, but I did my bachelor back in Mongolia and interested in international relations a bit. And then actually one of my lecturer professor was really interested in that Dalai Lama and how that Tibetan Buddhist religion can play the soft power in Central Asia, and that's why I mentioned that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick Anucci. That was most interesting. I mean, we really haven't heard much about Mongolia. A lot of the facts you present us with tonight are sort of new to me, and I'm sure that they will be to quite a number of our audience. Now is the time to put our hands together for our speakers first. We are all bristling with questions out there, so yes, right there.
Thank you very much for just two lovely talks
Yes.
about Mongolia. And yeah, I've always been fascinated in the Silk Road, and so one of the reasons I came here, but also it brought me up to date with a lot of things. I have two questions, if I may. One is, if I wanted to go to Mongolia, do I have to go via China or Russia? That's the first question. And the second one was, having two totalitarian states on either side, is there a slight protection for Mongolia in that neither wants to give the other totalitarian state part of the prize, which is Mongolia? In other words, having both being totalitarian, does that help Mongolia just a little bit? I know you're in a terrible situation, but is there some silver lining to that?
Do you want the hard question or the easy question?
I can give a little bit thing for now you in terms of transportation, you can just directly fly into Mongolia. There's no like you actually the major transition for the flight is in South Korea. So there's no restriction from China and Russia in terms of traveling. In terms of that, Russia and China between two superpower, Mongolia is trying to balance these two superpowers. So Mongolian national independence is actually dependent on the Russia and China's balance. So there are, I saw this interesting photo that two cats connected with this this lining, and there was a mouse between them. So either one of them can't let the other get the mouse. So that's the silver lining that the Mongolian national security actually depended. Yes.
Just to clarify, so there are no direct flights from Australia to Mongolia. I wish that make life easy. It's usually about 20 to 25 hours transit minimum. And like I said, you could go to Seoul, you could go to Japan, and since China opened their borders, you can fly through Hong Kong as well. So that's a shorter route. That's 18 hours. So, there's not much to add on to that, other than the fact that Mongolia has generally benefited from that scenario, right? For the most part, China does not want Mongolia, or they've expressed that, and for the most part, that seems to be reinforced by their actions. And they already got the prize, which was Southern Mongolia, which was the more populous part of the country, and also loaded with most of the minerals and mining at the time. Russia has already got their part. They got Lake Baikal, which is north of Mongolia, and the deepest freshwater lake in the world. So they have what they want. There's not really much of a desire for them to have the grand steppes. They already have the steppes in Kazakhstan, or they did during the Soviet Union. So there wasn't enough of a reason for them to express their desire to take all of Mongolia as a part of the Soviet Union or as a part of China.
We have a question from up the back there first.
Thank you, David.
And then
I'm from a landlocked country, Nepal.
Nepal.
You know, you just mentioned Nepal. And Nepal, Switzerland, Mongolia, they are all there.
if you could speak up a little.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't know this much information before. Today was very interesting listening to you two guys, Nick and Usukhbold. Please, can you tell me about how do you maintain relation between China, Russia, and USA? Because we in Nepal, we are struggling to balance relation between India and China. Sometimes it comes, the USA comes in the middle, intervening, like there was a big developing project which was passed from the parliament last year. which is called MCC.
Mm.
You know, this changed a lot in Nepalese geopolitical situation. So Mongolia is a friend of North Korea and not leaning with China, friend of Russia, helping, supporting Russia and Ukraine in balanced way. How can you balance this geopolitical?
Okay. Over here.
I can jump in.
I think Nick.
I think we might wind the question and hear the answer.
Yeah, so great question. That is very, very tricky, especially in third neighbor policy. So Mongolia really, like I said, they really pursue this neutrality and impartiality in all of their verbiage. And a lot of the projects, they had the MCC in Mongolia as well. And when that was first introduced, it created a lot of tension. But most of the politicians, the diplomats there, recognize the terrible position that Mongolian government finds itself in. And a lot of the projects now keep a stiff arm from anything that revolves around supporting democratic processes or neoliberalism. A lot of it now is focusing on renewable energy, on water, on environmental conservation. And that is how, I don't want to say they're getting around, but that's how they're framing a lot of the investment. Japan just won the first solar battery project in Mongolia. They built the first airport, the largest international airport in Japan and in Mongolia as well. And they make sure that they frame it in a way that's not going to antagonize the Chinese or the Russians. And so, like, for example, I run an NGO right now called Friends of Mongolia. And when we were re-registering our NGO, we got asked the questions, do we ever intend of sending our students that we offer scholarships to the United States? The Mongolian government is very interested in that, because if we start offering to send students to the United States, that is going to have a negative impact on their relations, right? And it's going to start asking a lot of questions. So they're very involved and very inquisitive as to the operations of civil society organizations. But they've tended to balance it very well. Yeah.
Sorry, additionally, David, just
Okay.
30 seconds. If our prime minister tries, if he becomes the prime minister for the, on the first visit, he would like to, visit China or India. It's a big political pull over, And if he goes to India, the Chinese complains, and if he goes to China, India complains. Does Mongolia face these sort of things between Russia, China, or the Western?
I think the current the party is pretty much friendly with both of the neighbors. So they I think they but their totalitarian and authoritarian regime is probably playing another part in that, because but I think it's not because of how Mongolia chooses Russia or China, but it's decided between Russia and China how they look at that relationship.
Okay. We have a question here.
I do, and I feel like it's kind of been answered though, because I was curious about the tension between China and Russia and being in the middle, and the third neighbor policy effectively, I guess it kind of, as a metaphor, you mentioned trying to keep the lake calm, and it sort of feels as if you're sort of keeping the peace, but at the same time really wanting that safety net somehow out there and trying to seek that part. And with you studying education, I'm wondering, you're building the minds of the future. What would be, I mean, in an ideal world, what would be the sort of end goal in terms of, like, would Mongolia, do you think, want to embrace a democracy? Voting shows they don't, they prefer communism. Yeah, like, a very hard question to answer, I appreciate, but do you have an inclination of, like, where you think the country would like to go if they didn't have to sort of sit between those two tensions, I guess?
Yeah, I think I read some article about that actually. My thesis is concerning about how Mongolian education is changing from the socialist period into a neoliberal period. And the main reason that Mongolia embraced democracy and neoliberal policies is that they want to be little bit different than Russia and China in terms of politically. And then the Mongolian citizens actually want to have this democratic and market-based society for them. And then that tells how the Mongolian education or how the political and how the international relations go, because Mongolia wants to have a different future or different plan for the future that differs from the Russia and China. And then they want to have that in terms of politics and ideology.
I think we have some online questions, Ben.
Yes, I've got one here from Penny. She asks, what UN agencies operate in Mongolia, and where and how does climate change concerns figure in Mongolian foreign policy?
You take the UN, not climate change.
I think in Ulaanbaatar there are effectively there's most of the United Nations and its sub organizations operating in Mongolia. So you can find UNESCO, UNDP, and everything in Mongolia and from Ulaanbaatar. And that's the another thing that in Ulaanbaatar, almost half of the population live in Ulaanbaatar in this single country, and that makes lots of problem. Also makes it a little bit easier for the international organizations or the larger organizations to operate.
To continue with that, I had the luck of going to the UNDP. I'm sorry, the UN House in UB, and they have, like you said, the majority of the offices operating out of there. They also have the think tank for landlocked developing countries based out of there as well. And so most of the UN agencies are operating, thankfully, out of UB. Regarding climate change, that is a huge mess in Mongolia, right? So Mongolia's natural disaster is winter. We don't really experience that here in Brisbane, but I got to go back in winter. It was, like I said, minus 45. And when they have years back to back where the rain isn't enough, right, where the pastures don't get the support that they need, and now with the market economy, there is a large number of livestock. You know, in 2018, it was 22 livestock animals per every person in Mongolia, and that's continuously grown. So it leads to a lot of desertification, and a lot of families are struggling with that. So climate change is a huge thing on a lot of people's minds. There's a lot of development projects going in on that, especially about fresh water and water availability, which challenges a lot of the mining industries. And there's a lot of corporate social responsibility discussions that are happening all across at all levels about what are these mining companies and what are these other agencies, what do they owe to the local population. And so it is the elephant in the room, and they are addressing it one bite at a time. So.
Okay. I just got a question. What's the poverty rate in Mongolia? Are there people at the bottom strata, and is there a social safety net? And what policies are being aimed at people who are down the bottom of the society?
I'll start. You finished? So great question. Poverty rate right now is anywhere between 32 and 34%. Inflation rate is also significantly high. Last time I checked, a couple months ago, it was 14.5%. It is incredibly difficult for families to get by right now if they don't have a decent job. And the job market, unfortunately, is abysmal. You know, a lot of repercussions from COVID, a lot of businesses that, you know, had to close their operations throughout COVID in general. It has really, really serious impacts. Thankfully, you know, like I said, the economy is turning around, and there was finally an agreement reached with Rio Tinto this past summer, or Australian winter. And so there's a lot of opening for investment. There's a lot of turnaround there, but we're talking 33, 34%. And poverty level there, the average government worker is making the equivalent of 400 Australian dollars a month. And so it's really difficult, right? And while the cost of living in Mongolia might be a little bit cheaper, or is quite a bit cheaper, if you are looking for a solid education, external or international education, good luck, right? How are you going to be able to fund that kind of stuff if you don't get scholarships, if you don't get financial support?
Yeah, from the education perspective, half of the schools in Ulaanbaatar has privatized it, the private schools, and some of the private schools fee is same as Brisbane grammar schools.
Wow.
Yeah, and but the other public schools got 60 or 70 kids in single classroom. So that shows that social inequality and education inequalities and how the poverty and these the shock therapy and neoliberal policies affected Mongolia.
Okay. How are we going for time? Another one? Up the back and then here.
I was just curious where the relations with Taiwan fit in with the third neighbor.
Yeah. Very awkward. So Mongolia runs something called the UB Security Dialogues, and was lucky enough to attend that this past Australian winter. We don't talk about Taiwan. It is not brought up at the UB Security Dialogues, nor do they have representatives from Taiwan. And that question was asked during the UB Security Dialogue from someone who runs NORPI, which is the North Asia Regional Peace Institute, which focuses on youth peace building. She asked that question, and there was no response. It's very difficult. So yeah. I know I'm not answering your question because I don't have an answer to the question either. But there are some opportunities for Mongolians to study in Taiwan, and so at the individual level, there are relations built. But yeah,
we've got time for one last question. That's you, sir.
Very quickly, I was wondering whether the education and the 60 kids per in classroom, etc., whether things were better under the socialist regime.
I think the answer would be yes, because it's simply that the Soviet Union and the socialist countries support Mongolia to have the better education, and using Mongolian education in somehow like PR for their agendas. That like the backward nomadic countries change it into an educated country because of the socialist ideology. So yes, during the socialist period, Mongolian education was, I think.
Yes.
Thank you once again to our speakers, and what a great crowd again. Yes. People really did want to know about Mongolia.
Yeah.
Thank you. Look, we have a blockbuster event next week. It's all the arms of statecraft, the Albanese government's Pacific and international development strategies. And our speaker is the Minister for International Development and the Pacific, the Honourable Pat Conroy MP. May 9. Harnessing the Power of Women in Sports. Our speaker is Associate Professor Poppy Satiriodou, who's one of our lovely counsellors here. From Griffith Uni on how the achievements of female athletes can be a diplomatic tool to enhance the legacies of the 2032 Brisbane Olympics. That's May 9, so look in for that one. May 23, something a bit different. Australia's humanitarian response and Pacific Partnership. We've got Shelley Thomas and Mark Brookhausen of the Humanitarian Logistics Capability. That's a group put together by Palladium International. They're going to discuss how their HLC organisation supports the Australian government in responding to humanitarian crisis in the Indo-Pacific. Now, people who are long-term members here will remember Dr. Peter Layton. He's been a long-term member here. On June 13, he's going to be talking about Australia's Goldilocks Defence Strategic Review. Too hot, too cold, or just right. So come along and listen to Peter Layton. I think the Defence Strategic Review has been released this week, hasn't it? Yeah. June 27 is the world finished with free trade. Speaker is former Federal Minister Craig Emerson, who you will know. July 11, empowering women as peace advocates against political violence. Now, the speaker here is Dr. Kiriloy Ingram. She's going to speak on the roles that women are playing in trying to prevent political violence in Mindanao in southern Philippines. And a very topical one on July 25. Critical minerals as tools of economic statecraft. And the speaker is Namali Mackay, who's the Managing Director of Critical Minerals Australia. Association in Australia. So keep an eye on your emails, keep an eye on the website. We've never organised this much in such a hurry before, so we've got events all the way through to August. And once again, thank you for coming tonight. Thank you.